I'm Dane Rose, and I thought I'd begin by outlining who this is for and what its purpose is. So, my thought is 35-year-old men or older who have life skills together and are wanting to turn inward is the niche of people that I can most effectively help. Why men? Well, one of the issues that I deal with is a blurry line between friendship and sexuality and presence with women that was blurred early on with my mother being promiscuous with me as a child. And the combination of that blurry boundary between platonic intimacy and sexual intimacy makes me less safe for women in a therapeutic context. The second thing is that I've generally felt and adopted in my own life that it's hard enough to try and grasp and cope with relational and emotional issues with all of your money and life skills in order, but that it's completely overwhelming to try and manage things like, high debts, employment, learning to drive, all the different life skills that we need to develop and go deeply into the psyche in our culture. And so my own pattern was, certainly start working with this material early on, but I didn't really spend any money on it until I had a house, I had, life skills, ran my own business, etc. And so, any age is good for working with videos and books, etc. But I want to suggest that reducing external fear is an important preparation for consciously stepping into internal fear. And thirdly, I think that somewhere between 28 and 40 years old is the point where a man has enough experience with who they are with life that on the one hand there's enough perspective, and on the other hand, there's a certain amount of tempering and a predisposition to having been exposed to the full terrain of emotions and the full terrain of the psyche. Well, not the full terrain, but to have a good taste of the different states and probabilities. So that's who I'm talking to. And, anyone younger, any women, looking at this material as a thought stimuli, as preparation to work towards, I think is great. But that's the group of people that I think I may, in some situations, be able to help go to the next level. Now, how this came about for me personally was a deep disappointment in over $100,000 in therapy. And, just finding later just how much was left out of that protocol. I worked with 30 practitioners. I've spent, well over $300,000 in different growth-oriented avenues and started early at age 12 when I began working with the channel Lazarus. And so this is a kind of a accumulation of noticing the pros and cons of different approaches and the blind spots that were not addressed to me by any of my therapists. And I want to begin by outlining what is the psyche and what is psychic healing. So the psyche is the probability field for the species, for human beings. And we get glimpses into that probability field through the cultural repertoire of our humanity and through mythology. If you read the fairy tales, the mythologies, the Norse myths, the Russian fairy tales, the Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist deities, the Indian deities, and the Sikh, and I forget the other religion, you begin to get a sense of the possibility, the probability field that is the human psyche. Now, within the psyche, we break down into 10,000 cultures and 10,000 languages that have expressed themselves over time within our species. And within that, within our culture, we have the individual ego. Now, the psyche is the probability field. And we need to find our relationship, the relationship between the ego that we define as us and the probability field that is humanity, that is all that is probable as a species. And in understanding all that is probable, the Second World War is probable, the Korean War is probable, chemical warfare, nuclear weapons, nuclear annihilation, these are probabilities. And so is beautiful architecture. So is promiscuous sexuality. So is abusing children. So is protecting innocence. So is dying to protect children. These are all parts of the human expression. And they are all probable for us as a human being, for us as an individual ego. However, what we actually create and experience is primarily directed from our conscious mind. And the more conscious we are of what parts of the probability field that we want to experience and what parts that we don't, and the ways that we engage those parts of reality and the ways that we don't, the more conscious we are of that, the more we can steer ourselves into the probability fields that might be known as intelligence. Intelligence defined as the efficiency with which energy, time, money, natural resources are transformed into human well-being. A highly intelligent person creates enormous amounts of sustainable well-being for numbers of people while consuming very little time, money, and natural resources to have such an impact. The complete lack of intelligence is someone who spends enormous amounts of time, money, and energy to cause great deals of unnecessary suffering. So we have our human ego, and then we have, which is our sense of us, and then we have this whole probability field. And by definition, the part that is identified as us is less than 1% of everything out there. 99.99999% is out there beyond the bounds of the ego. Now, what psychic healing is, and what dis-ease is in our relationship with the psyche, is when, one, we become fixated. So, for example, let's say there's a childhood trauma that happened right here. And in our relationship with that childhood trauma at the time, we form a bond. And the bond says, I am never getting near that again. I'm not going to remember it. I'm not going to feel it. I'm never going to feel that way again. I'm never going to let someone do that to me. So now we've got an arm's length relationship that's rigid. That rigidity becomes a causal force in our reality. It can become a blind spot if we refuse never to see that or remember that again. It can cause the pattern to repeat if we refuse to talk about and deal with it. It leads us to spend energy maintaining a rigid stance because we don't know how to deal with it. So we spend more and more of our energy saying, I'm never going to feel that, I'm never going to feel that, I'm never going to feel that, but we're spending lots of energy not to feel that. So we have a dis-ease. We can no longer navigate. It's kind of like looking out of a window and blocking off a certain area and saying, I can't see that. And then you move over here, and you got to move the block over here, and you move the block over here. And in the process, there's a certain amount of data that's taken offline. Now, if you walk around with a big blob in front of you so that you can't see stuff, you bang into things. And that's part of the residue of a fixated relationship with a moment in time, with a point in the emotional dial. Because we have the psyche of our personal psyche, which is this whole terrain within all the inner ages. As we grow from zero and even pre-birth, as we're in the womb, all the way to the present time, our body stores those patterns and those memories. And in order to fully see who we are, we need to see those patterns and memories and understand how they've influenced us to become the ego shape that we are. So the psyche is the probability field, and in a healthy relationship, there is a dance where the conscious mind can feel the full range of emotions, can understand and relate to the full tapestry of culture, can explore the full range of time, the time in human history to the present, the time in personal history and in body history from birth to present. Now you have an easy relationship between time, between emotion, between thoughts, and you can traverse this terrain where you know you can kill, you know you can love, you know what it feels like to hate, you know what it feels like to bless something, and you can navigate through that terrain without getting stuck in a fixation. Now, a fixation is, I'm never going to do that. Fixation is, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to feel that again. Now that's obviously, a fixation serves a purpose. It marks a terrain. It starts consuming energy. You become more conscious of that domain. A fixation can be a teacher, but it is also a dis-ease. And so you ultimately want to arrive at a place where, without the crutches of your fixations, you can freely navigate anywhere within the psyche, but prefer and choose to navigate in such a way that as a personal ego, you have a relationship with grace and of grace with your entire probability field, and an understanding that while you could be a murderer like anyone else, you could be a rapist like anyone else, you could be an incest survivor like anyone else, that you prefer not to. That you prefer to move with grace, with understanding, with freedom, towards healing, towards symmetry, towards joy, towards conscious mastery and excellence, as a preference. Now, before you can do that, one must gain access to the full range of human emotion without attachment, without the judgment that freezes that up, without the attachment of looking spiritual or I'm evil, whatever the attachment is, the ability to move through that, to understand the probability field. And it's very much like the psyche is a dial pad. And when you have a dial pad on a phone, you can create any number in the universe with these 10 digits. 1-206-743-0002 brings you one number. 3-402-892-0201 brings you another number. You want to reach the place where you can dial the numbers for the resonance and the reality that you want to experience and create, while holding space that all the other numbers are possible to be dialed with this dial pad. Now, what happens when we experience trauma, when we experience overwhelm, when we experience being punished, when we experience conscious cruelty, evil, dissociation, shock, is our symmetrical ego gets dinged up, gets shattered, gets cracked. Plus, as I say, we form attachments. If you have 2 points in time, I'm always going to look here and I'm never going to feel here. You've locked the life process in place. It's very difficult to move freely and creatively through the probability field. If you're always going to see it this way and you're never going to see it this way. Because perspective shifts as you shift, as you move through reality. You have to understand and deal with perspective. What healing the ego is is not healing the psyche. The psyche is what it is. It's a probability field. But it's kind of like if your finger is frozen on the letter 1, you can't dial other numbers. You can't even complete fully dialing the existing number. You're in a fixation. And so it's about healing the asymmetries that are formed as coping mechanisms. And so there's some steps to do that. What we're looking for is to restore the ego to symmetry, in a non-fixated relationship and in a conscious relationship with all the many dots. In reality, you've had this experience, no doubt, where there's all kinds of things changing and shifting around in your life, and yet you're fixated on this one pattern or this one event because you invested an enormous amount of energy as a child, as a teenager, as an adult, or a grown-up, saying, I definitely don't want that to happen and I want this to happen instead. That fixation is a symptom of trauma. And so one of the first things that I want you to do on this journey is take the months that it will likely take to read or listen to the book. It's available on Audible. I recommend that. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Because that's where you learn more about the cultural fixation points. For example, taboos are fixation points within the culture. And when you're dealing with healing trauma, you're wanting to find those areas of overwhelm and threat to the ego's survival, socially, financially, physically, and clear off the charge, physically, mentally, and emotionally, so that you can have a free-flowing relationship with all of the objects in memory and all of the possible objects in your reality and in your future. I'm going to leave it at this for now, and we'll continue on the next video. I want to talk about what the ego is because I think it's a really important framework to get a handle on. Consciousness is what erupts in the tension and in the distinction between a zoom lens. You take the big picture lens and you zoom it down to the focus of looking at reality through 5 observing and measuring devices, the nose, the ears, etc. And it's worth noting that this is only observing a very small portion of reality because there are smells that are above and below the frequency that the nose can detect. There's light above and below the frequency that the eyes can detect. There's sound above and below the frequency of which ears can detect. There's touch, which is above and below the frequency with which our skin can sense other mass. Then we have the lens of thought and feeling, which are both in and outside of the body. You can have lucid dreams, you can have transpersonal experiences outside of the body, and you can have out-of-body experiences, but there's still the sense of associating the me with that consciousness that has distinctly remembered all of the records of all of the sensory experience that this body has recorded. Now then it gets, so, we have, and then you have the phenomena with many writers, myself included, that at times when you're communicating, you're letting something flow through that is not you, meaning it doesn't emerge out of a natural synergy of what's come before, but rather it's as if there's enough of an openness that certain patterns can make it through the filters of beliefs, attitudes, values, and be presented to the conscious mind. This is the ego, which is a lens. It's literally a zoom-in lens that says, I'm going to focus really tight on this area of reality. And it gets even more specific, because within the ego, you've got all of this sensory information coming in. And then, aside from the fact that you're in a very tiny part of the planet, which is in a very tiny part in the time continuum, which is in a very tiny part of the universe, which is in a very tiny part of the multiverse, which is in this particular multiverse of all the probable multiverses, despite, this speck of a speck of phenomena. And then despite identifying as one person, a personality, and recording the memories of this body, and then only registering a very tiny fraction of the full vibrational spectrums. I mean, do you realize that if we added 20 more senses, they would all be able to pick up something that we don't pick up? Just like, extremely sensitive microphones that pick up more than the human ear and amplify them, hear an entire soundscape that we don't pick up. But that's just within the frequency of sound. We don't have language to talk about the frequencies of energy. And we're talking about amplitudes when we talk about frequencies. We don't have language to talk about that energy that may not fit within the definition of energy. And yet those worlds can be right next to our world. And when we don't have the sensory apparatus to perceive them, and we don't have the language apparatus to imagine or articulate them, they don't exist for us at all. But it doesn't mean they're not real. It means they're not real to us. So even when we get down to the very little bit that is real to us in our little bit here, we nonetheless have a yet further filter that, while 100% of the data comes in through the senses, that is measurable in our little pocket of the multiverse, half of it is unconscious. That we focus on the half that remains after we discard the other half. And this is the framework through which we experience not reality, but our representation of reality. So the power of the lens paradigm is that, let's say we say that's real out there. And I look out there and I see one of my paintings, which you don't see, and I see, purple and gold, I see a crystal light, I see reality. But that's not actually what I see. What I see is a representation of that reality created through these observing and measuring devices. And if we look at a lens, the design of the lens, for example, frames the image. If we have a rectangular lens, you see a rectangle. You see, you're looking through a lens right now. You're perceiving me through the lens of this camera. Now, this camera doesn't see ultraviolet. It doesn't see X-rays. Now, if I cover this, your lens disappears, but the X-rays don't. There's still a lot of data. Now, you're looking at a multidimensional reality, not only through 5 senses, but through a lens that turns this into a square. This shapes your perception of reality. You're not dealing with reality. You're dealing with a representation of reality. You're not dealing with me. You're dealing with a representation of me. You're dealing with a visual representation that has the illusion of being square. You're dealing with the part of me that fits into this frame because, typically I would move about. But you're not seeing the move about representation. You're seeing a representation of a representation of a representation. And the really interesting thing is, like, some of you are going to be focused on the fact that because I ate a delicious custom pasta with a fair amount of cheese, there's a little bit more, starch and dairy in my system, and so this bit of nose here is itchy. Now, some of you are going to notice that. Others of you are going to obsess about that. Others of you, it doesn't exist, like the gorilla that walks through the basketball game. Your attention is on something else. And it's that last little bit of interpretation of reality that is most interesting. Because it's the way that we create our reality out of the reality. So you have the reality, and then we have an intention. For example, we can create a comedy out of this probability field. We can create a comedy, we can create a success. If I want to create a success, and what we're looking at right now is the structure of the ego and the reality that exists within egoic consciousness that we have a fair amount of influence over, because intention will determine where we look, for one, and attention within that 50% split will again determine what we see. And there's enough variation, there's enough chaos and color that we can create a wide range of reality within the framework of what we produce. So the big question is, why are we here and what is healing? And to answer that question, we have to take a step back and look at purpose and what is intelligence. And what I'd like to suggest is that intelligence is the efficiency with which well-being is created with the energy available. In other words, if you've got 1 unit of energy, time, money, natural resources, and one person creates a design that turns that 1 unit of energy into 5 units of sustainable well-being. Now, why sustainable? Well, you can use credit card debt or cocaine or something to boost the short-term yield, but pay a long-term price that gives you a net negative. And so when you look at sustainable well-being, you're looking at an algorithm that just keeps on growing as far as you can see into the future. Planting a tree is an example. You plant a tree and next year it's a little bigger, and every year after that it's producing more and more oxygen. It's an appreciating asset. It's incredibly intelligent. Now, we gauge intelligence based on that efficiency. Who can create what level of human well-being? And we can see this in airline aviation or any kind of transportation. You'd never take off on a plane and fly all the way around the globe and then come back to a destination an hour away. It's consuming vast amounts of time, money, fuel, etc. That's unnecessary. And so that's our metric of intelligence. And the biggest game in town is to create the most sustainable, growing transformation of energy into resources that is available. It's fun, and at the same time, in order to master that on a scientific level with mastery, it requires discipline and self-awareness. It takes you on a journey through all of the different mental mechanisms, the body, the biology, that intersection of biology and emotion. You must become masterful and disciplined and self-aware. And so it's this perfect masculine-feminine balance. And so what you're trying to do is create an ego that is capable of participating in the balancing dynamic within the larger psyche and human probability field. And you're also looking to polish and sharpen your lens to a point that it can be in the present. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we understand that the ego is a lens, a zoom-in lens, that's separating you from most of the larger ecology, well, if you have an interaction with someone and it sprays oil on the lens, then you have another interaction and you get some paint on the lens, and you have another interaction and you've got some blood on the lens, a little water on the lens. Pretty soon, aside from the greatly stepped down, highly selective version of reality, you're now looking through a blurry filter. So you need to clean the lens of the past residue so that what you're seeing in the moment is true to the moment without the obscurity of past residue. So what we're looking to do is keep the lens clean. We're also looking to refract the lens, to develop the lens symmetrically so that what comes through the lens does not get distorted because the lens is distorted. And here's where we come into things like paradigms. Paradigms are, for example, in the paradigm of chauvinism, male, female, masculine, feminine chauvinism. Chauvin was a French nobleman who was a bit of a stuck-up, snooty person. That's why chauvinism is people being stuck up and snooty about something. So chauvinism is, male chauvinism is the overvaluing of masculine energy and the undervaluing of feminine energy. And if you understand polarity, you have the whole, and the whole is divided into two equal halves. That's what polarity is. And one part is masculine, and one part is feminine. And so now you've got the entire paradigm of the multiverse divided into two poles. And some languages do this very specifically. The table is masculine, the floor is feminine, and it's a little bit strange, but you divide the whole into two parts, and scientifically they're both equal. That's the definition of polarity. You have the whole, you cut it in half, now you've got two parts of the whole. Well, a scientist doesn't say that 380 pounds, this part of the half, and 380 pounds, the other part of the half of that whole, are different. But culture is an overlay, and culture is not always scientific. And so culturally, we've gotten into the habit of thinking that masculine energy is more valuable than feminine energy. And that's part of our chauvinism. Well, that's a skewed lens, because looking through that paradigm, we amplify the positive traits of the masculine, and we minimize the positive traits of the feminine to maintain an unscientific view. And so when we're looking at healing, we're looking at restoring the wholeness of our relationship here. Now, the same goes on when we're looking at positive or negative energy. For example, if you're angry about something, but angry feelings are taboo, the taboo is what destroys the sense of wholeness. So if anger is taboo, but feeling nice is fine, or even encouraged, then anytime you feel nice, you exaggerate that. Anytime you feel anger, you suppress that. And so you create a distorted lens. Now, the more distorted the lens, the more you tend to interact with reality in a distorted way. And the more you interact with the larger ecology of which you are a part in a distorted way, the more unnecessary suffering there is. So here's the individual personality ego relating to the psyche. Within the psyche is all of the probable realities, which include all the realities going on the planet at any given point. There are children being raped, there are rainforests being set fire with gasoline right now, there are, corrupt businessmen siphoning off funds from, pensioners. There's beauty, there's flowers growing, there's the magic of the moon. There's an entire set of reality that's out there. And within that set of reality, we choose, to the extent that we're able to, where we locate ourselves, what our status is within that location. Do we change citizenship? Do we live here? Do we live there? We position ourselves within that probability field. And then we also turn our attention on different things. And the goal is to develop a relationship with the larger reality of which we're a part. And here we come back to paradigm, but we have this very narrow paradigm on an individual level that says this is me and these are all those other people and they're not me. And yet we can shatter that paradigm when we start paying attention. We look at who made this body. Well, my parents made the body. And who made their bodies? And, well, their parents made their bodies. And by the time we go back 1 or 2 generations, they didn't even live in this country, America. So other countries made the people who made the people who made American bodies. And we can already go back just through the physical dimension to, the entire beginning of the species. You realize that if those people at the beginning of the species didn't exist, then no one else did either. So now we realize there's a connection with time. That if the past didn't exist, this didn't exist. And then we look, okay, well, I'm still a self-made person. I'm me. And it's like, well, who is you? And everything you use to describe you is language. And all of that language is inherited. Meaning there is a word for a small feeling that is capped with a vibration that has grief under it that it can't come out, and it's invisible within the cultural language in which, and the cultural landscape in which it's trying to emerge. There is a word for that, but not in our vocabulary, not in our language. And so the feeling doesn't get acknowledged and doesn't exist because we don't have a word for it. There is a grief of germinating seeds that want to come forth and that don't fit within the rhythm, the routine, and the focus, the dimensional myopia of our culture. And there is a sadness. There are tears that want to come out because that bit can't penetrate the asphalt of our culture and blossom. And as it begins to blossom, it's railroaded over by another unconscious force within the culture. And so there's a sadness and a grief that's there, but it's not conscious because we don't have language for it. And so it's like, well, where did the language come from? Well, it didn't come from you and me. It came from the people who shaped the language. And what did they develop words for? The Eskimos had 400 words for snow. We have one word for love. Well, what it means is that the Eskimos valued their relationship with snow 400 times more than we value our relationship with the feelings and the words around love. Because truly, there are 400 different types of love. But we barely know what the first word means. You see, in the 400 words for snow were survival-based, which is an elevated, prioritized area of the brain. You see, there's a word for snow that says there's a 60% chance that a critical threshold will be met within the snow, and that if you don't understand that critical threshold, you could die before you arrive at your destination. That there's a different kind of shoe you want to wear if the snow is on the edge of ice going to water or on the edge of water going to ice. And if you don't know that difference and you wear the wrong kind of shoes, in Eskimo territory you could be dead. Or you could spend a month trying to make new shoes out of natural animal skins. And so 400 words for snow respects the effort that it takes to grow a human being. If one is just killed because they thought it was this type of snow and it was that type. Now, we don't value in a chauvinistic context the human heart enough to make those distinctions. Because when I say I love you, I mean something completely different than what you're hearing. But your shoes aren't worn out because of that confusion. Your heart is broken, or you're a bit disappointed, or you feel frustrated, or you feel anxious and you don't know why. But we just tune that out. And so a culture honors, through its vocabularies, the values and the states that it has. So we can't say that language is innate about us. It's deeply rooted in our culture. And then what about these clothes, right? These are my clothes. Well, this jacket was designed, this turtleneck was designed by a Korean working freelance for an American multinational company who shipped the design to Bangladesh to have cotton imported from Africa, shipped over in a boat run by the Dansk shipping company in Denmark, back to me with more than 1 billion man-hours invested in the technologies just to get this shirt. Well, is that really my shirt? What about those 1 billion man-hours without which it doesn't exist? And then what, this is my necklace? 200 million-year-old stones? Quartz is 40 to 200 million years old. We've got 3 types of quartz. That's multiple mines. Again, shipping companies, the Industrial Revolution. Oh, and then this is my body, except that, every breath, every taste, there's absolutely nothing here that is all about me. There's a dance with the ecological environment. Oh, and of course the bracelet from an Italian village, Damanhur, inspired by a mystic who had visions from who knows where, who built one of the world's largest underground temples with visions and ideas that had nothing to do with the outer landscape, nothing to do with Italy. You might think came from another planet, another dimension. So is this mine? Because I handed over some bits of paper for doing some things that I earned from doing some things within this paradigm called capitalism that I didn't invent. See, there's nothing here. Absolutely nothing. The camera, you think I invented that? You did? No. The frame stops here. This is the ego. Goes out here, it's outside the frame, outside the frame. Inside, it's in the frame. But just because it goes outside the frame doesn't mean it isn't intimately and inextricably connected to what's inside the frame. Just because it's in the lens called ego doesn't mean that you aren't intimately and intricately connected with everything else outside the lens of ego. And so this is the landscape. This is the landscape in which we're in. And so the game is to create sustainable well-being efficiently. That's where the masculine and the science comes in. Efficiently. It's like in a car. Sure, you can drive a gas guzzler and get 2 miles to the gallon. Good for you. But what about 89 miles per gallon? Or Elon Musk's revolution with the Tesla cars that are transforming sunlight directly into transformation? Is that more intelligent when we understand the levels of brain dementia that come from particulate, breathing particulate fumes in the atmosphere? Is that more intelligent to increase our health, reduce noise pollution, increase enjoyment, better the environment, to create more well-being with less units of energy, less time, less money, less natural resources needed to generate that additional amount of energy? And I think that's the definition of intelligence, and that's the game. So what we're looking at is, how do we create a relationship between this illusionary, we have the illusion or the representation that we create of reality within consciousness that we create, as we interact with reality. We have we have that. And then we have this partition of the self that is seemingly, through our senses and through our culture, separate from everything else, but is actually connected to everything else. This moment is connected to every other time, past, present, and future, meaning the future doesn't exist without this moment. You can't just delete 10 minutes and the future still continues, because the future is connected to this moment. The past is connected to this moment. Without, if this bit in the past changed, then this bit changes here. It's connected. And so we're trying to find our place in reality, and we're trying to find our relationship with reality through the representation of reality we create with our ego, which is a process of becoming more and more neutral and open to what is, and working with what is, learning from what is, growing from what is, responding to what is. And healing is to make whole again. Healing is to take the imbalances that we've experienced coming towards us environmentally and from others, and to heal those imbalances, to bring them back to a wholeness, so that we can show up in the present, and in the present with intelligence, so that we can play this game of ever moving towards more and more well-being sustainably per unit of energy invested. So what's our journey? Well, one of the big things that you want to look for is the sphere. The sphere is the compass point. Meaning, if you can't see anything painful in the world, but you can see everything's positive, you don't see the full circle. If you can only see black, but you can't see white or red or anything else, you don't see the full circle. If you can only feel love, but not suspense, you don't have access to the full wheel of emotion. So part of the journey is to move towards symmetry, to move towards wholeness. Now, one of the big things that affects us is biological ignorance and emotional ignorance. So we have a culture that is focused very strongly on technicalities, technology, and very little on psychology, on biology, the biology of emotions. And so one of the big blind spots we have, and a place that we can develop our ego, is learning about trauma. Now, when we learn about trauma on a biological, on a relational, on an emotional level, we position ourselves to clear some of the biggest burdens we carry from the past. And as we position ourselves to do that, we create the possibility of letting messages of life-threatening danger, with all that fear, we create the possibility of letting big weights and chunks of the past die. And that is a stunning accomplishment. And I want to close this segment by inviting you to read the book The Body Keeps the Score, to read the book Healing Trauma, Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, to understand that terrain, and look at James Fadiman's work on psychedelics. Those three create a nexus of possibility and understanding that can literally lift and transform our energy field into something powerful and beautiful. Let's look at a certain kind of journey that goes on as we enter and exit a human system. Now, this is not a perfect drawing, but it suggests an underlying cycle that's very valuable to understand. Now, each of us as adults in a Western culture, and I'm not sure about other cultures in as much detail. There's been 10,000 cultures in human history, and I don't know them all. But in a Western culture, one of the first things to become aware of is the pit. This is the place that is taboo to go. It's the place that's too dark to look. It's the place of forbidden emotions, forbidden feelings. We have the pit. This is the first place to look. The dark room, where a part of us has been kept, has been partitioned. And there's a nice series on Netflix called The Umbrella Academy, and we can see Vanya towards the end being placed in this pit by a series of chronic and repeated betrayals by first the father and then the eldest son in his loyalty to the father, where everything good about the child has been turned around and then turned into an enemy, and as a result becomes the enemy of the people who are treating it like an enemy. And so it's a good place to, if you understand mythology as a dream in which every character in the narrative is a part of yourself, and thus the narrative reveals the key to symmetry and both destroying and integrating relationship. It's a good stepping point when you know it's all a mythology, that the outer world, that the political world, that fairy tales, that movies, that they're all speaking. If they're connecting with you in any way emotionally, it's because you know that character inside you. And if you don't connect with it emotionally, you're not watching it. It's completely irrelevant. So we want to access the pit. This is the first part of the journey. And the pit leads us to the betrayal. Because in order for a part of the psyche to end up in the pit, it had to be betrayed there by another part of the psyche. In order for an individual to end up in a pit, it had to be betrayed there by other people in the circle. Now, within the betrayal, there is a message. And this is the core wound. And it's this message that is the injection point. So there's an energy, there's a toxic energy that's being injected into the body. And its form is the message. So, the delivery device for a toxin is usually a syringe. You make contact with the blood and you push the toxin into the body, and immediately the body goes rigid, starts falling to pieces, etc. And this is the delivery message of a toxin into the physical body. The delivery mechanism of the wound into the psyche is the message. The message is a symptom of a disease, it creates disease, and it is the disease. Well, it creates the disease. It's the structure around which disease will emerge. The message might be something that you're worthless. A really big one in betrayals is the message you're not worth fighting for. Yeah, I knew you might get raped if you were out with that guy. Yeah, I knew that guy wasn't safe. I saw him damaging someone else. But I didn't care about you enough to say anything. I didn't want to damage something that's mine in order to say something. This is the disease of the message. You weren't worth it. I don't value you. You don't matter. You're not worth the bother. It's something like that. Now, the message internalized, and it's internalized as we accept the behavior that delivers the message. Because if someone says, hey, you're not worth da-da-da-da-da, and we say, get the fuck out of here, I am, we're not internalizing the message. But if someone says, you're not worth it, da-da-da-da-da, and we just stand there stunned, and they're like, okay, well, you're not worth standing around and learning how I've stunned you either. So they walk away, and you still stand there stunned, and they're like, well, that's your problem. It's not worth my bother to sort you out. The message is you're not worth it. Well, once that message is internalized, there's a hiding process. There's a shame. Because now we have to protect other people from seeing what is now the internalized truth, that is, we're not worth it. This shame is a trauma, which leads to addiction. Addiction is a compulsive, repetitive pattern of defense to numb the feeling that someone else gave us a message that we're not worth it, that we're unlovable in some way, and that we didn't fight the delivery of that message, which leads into addiction. The addiction leads to causing pain to other people, causing pain to ourselves. This takes us at some point into grief. Now, the grief is actually a healing process, this grief. It takes us into grief. Grief that we were not loved, grief that we were not valued, grief that we were not fought for, grief that we've hurt ourselves, grief that we've hurt others, grief that we're dissociated from ourselves and reality. Now, this can go back into this domain where we go deeper into addiction to avoid the grief and then cause more harm and then have more grief. So this can go back and forth for some time. But at some point, there's a compassion and a love that comes into the grief. In that dark room filled with grief and addiction, pain, there's some awakening within the self that says, I am worth it. I'm here for you. There is a witness that has gone through this entire process, and at some point the witness emerges and says, I'm here for you. I see you. Now, if the shame is too thick, you may run away and addict again to block the witness. But the one who stays there in the pain, outside or inside, or hopefully both, hopefully there's at least one person in your life that witnesses the descent and that comes back with, I understand and I see you and I'm here with you. Now, this is a very important thing because the message was, you're worthless. That's generally a subtext of the wound and the message. You're unlovable, so you're worthless. You're worthless, so you're unlovable. The message was you're worthless, but the witness's presence says the opposite. The witness's presence says that you are worth it. By embodying the choice to be there with you. So, and all these antics are going on, all this self-punishment, all this betrayal, etc. There's a witness that says, you're worth it. And this helps the transition into grief. And it also helps the transition move from grief into love. Now, all of this is traumatic, and the trauma helps to open up through dissociation with the familiar, through weakening the attachment to the familiar. Why? Well, you're not going to be terribly loyal to a pattern of people and energy that, stuck you into a pit and left you there. Why would you? So your loyalty to the status quo goes down. And in softening the loyalty to the status quo, it opens you to the possibility of things that are other, are beyond the circle. And this leads to the process of reaching out for divine help. Now, divine help in this sense is the energy outside of the set, the energy outside of the system. So it's not referencing any specific religion, any of that. Those are vehicles, containers through which that energy can come in. And you need a container. You need a ritual. You need a container for that divine energy to come in. And it doesn't matter what it is, but it's got to be marked by ritual space. Why? Because it's too big. You can't just run 2 billion volts through your system. It's got to come in through a container that has an element of ritual. And so divine help comes in through this doorway. For me, it was holding certain crystals and watching imagery come in. And so the energy leaked in through the imagery, created in the presence and in the resonance of consciousness that I could access through the beliefs, the thoughts, etc., connected with crystals. So because I have a predisposition in that direction, it's a doorway. Now other people might have a totem necklace, a crocodile tooth. It doesn't matter. Where you have a predisposition, you look to that doorway, and you have to create a ritual that takes you outside the tribe, outside the set, so that through that doorway, the energy that is other comes into the energy that is here. Now, this divine help leads to a bonding. It can be a bonding with self. It can be a bonding with a pet. It can be a bonding to another human being. It can be a bonding to a cause. It can be a bonding to a group. It leads to a bonding, a feeling of oneness with something bigger and other. You've got to embody that in some way. Now, in a marriage, for example, or in a service, this begins to set the path. That bond begins to set the template of where this new energy coming into the system is beginning to form. And this leads to birth. The birth of something as an emotion, as a feeling, as an idea. And this birth becomes a destiny. And this destiny takes shape. The destination is born from, it's the entire wheel. This destination, this destiny, emerges as a path of behavior out of the wound and the love that heals the wound. We now have an exit of the system of the wound with a level of conscious mastery that did not exist before you entered the wound cycle. You now have an exit as you transcend the limitation of the set in which you were a part. And in that transcendent state, you can now be a guide for this particular cycle. But you also carry the energy and the knowledge and the distinctions that are cultivated in going through any pain-pleasure cycle, because a pain-pleasure cycle is a cycle of distinction. It's a cycle of awareness. The more pain and pleasure you have, the more distinctions you become aware of in the tension between the two. So this is the essence of the human journey, the hero's journey, the adventure into darkness and back into light, creating the rainbow that exists between them.